The late afternoon sun burned through the smudged windows of the Pine Creek Animal Shelter, a squat brick building tucked off a dusty highway in rural Tennessee. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the faint musk of anxious animals. Inside, the lobby hummed with the low chatter of volunteers and the occasional bark echoing from the kennels. It was the kind of place where hope and heartbreak collided daily, where families came to adopt and others left empty-handed. But on this particular Thursday, the shelter was about to become a battleground for something far bigger than a routine adoption. James Jim Callahan, a wiry 68-year-old veteran with a face carved by decades of service, pushed through the glass doors, his worn boots scuffing the linoleum floor. His right hand gripped the leather leash of a sleek Belgian Malinois named Bravo, a dog whose every movement radiated precision and purpose. Bravo was no ordinary pet. His amber eyes scanned the room with the intensity of a soldier on patrol, his lean frame taut with the kind of discipline forged in places most people only saw on the news. No tags jingled on his collar, no vest announced his past, but the way he moved, silent, deliberate, always a step behind Jim, spoke of a bond that went beyond words. Jim had driven 40 miles from his small farmhouse to update Bravo's medical records, a routine task he'd done a dozen times since adopting the dog after their final deployment together. At 68, Jim was no stranger to bureaucracy. He'd navigated VA hospitals, pension paperwork, and enough red tape to choke a man. But he carried himself with the quiet resilience of someone who'd survived worse than forms in waiting rooms. Bravo, at 7 years old, was retired from active duty, his service in Afghanistan a chapter closed, but never forgotten. Together they were a unit, two souls who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. The receptionist, a young woman with a bored expression and a name tag reading Kayla, barely looked up from her phone as Jim approached the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat, her eyes flicking to the screen in her hand. "Need to update my dog's file," Jim said, his voice low but steady. "Medical records and ownership papers. Shouldn't take long." Kayla sighed, setting her phone down with the reluctance of someone interrupted mid-scroll. "Name and file number?" she asked, already typing before Jim could answer. "James Callahan for Bravo. File's under my name." He slid a folded stack of papers across the counter. Vaccination records, a faded certificate of ownership, and a military discharge form for Bravo, stamped with the seal of the 101st Airborne Division. Behind the counter, two volunteers sorting adoption flyers exchanged glances. One of them, a lanky kid in his early 20s named Ethan, leaned over to his coworker, a woman with bright pink hair named Tara. "Look at that guy," Ethan muttered, just loud enough for Jim to catch. "He's got to be pushing 70. How's he handling a dog like that? That Malinois looks like it could run circles around him." Tara smirked, not bothering to lower her voice. "Yeah, dogs like that need someone with, energy, not a grandpa who can barely walk straight." Jim's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd heard worse in his life. Insults in dive bars, whispers in VA waiting rooms about how he was too old for this or that. He let it roll off him, same as always. Bravo, sensing the shift in his handler's mood, tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching, but he stayed rooted at Jim's side, a silent sentinel. The situation might have stayed there just another day of casual judgment if not for the arrival of Officer Derek Pratt, a 28-year-old animal control officer with a badge too shiny and an ego to match. Pratt strode into the lobby like he owned it, his utility belt clinking with every step, his eyes locking onto Jim and Bravo with the smug certainty of a man who thought he'd already sized up the situation. "Hey, Kayla," Pratt called, bypassing Jim entirely. "What's the deal with this guy and the dog? Got a call about a high-risk breed in here." Kayla glanced at Jim, then back at Pratt, her expression shifting to one of mild annoyance. "He's just updating records. It's a Malinois, not a pit bull. Chill." Pratt didn't chill. He stepped closer, his gaze raking over Jim like he was inspecting a used car. "Sir," he said, his voice dripping with authority, "I'm going to need you to step back and let me take a look at that animal." We've got regulations about breeds like this in civilian hands. Jim's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed calm. He's mine. Been mine for years. We served together. Pratt snorted, a sound that cut through the lobby like a blade. Served together? What, you mean you fed him kibble while he was in some kennel overseas? That doesn't make him yours, Pops. Dogs like that need proper handling, not a senior citizen who can't keep up. The lobby, which had been buzzing with low chatter, went quiet. A family waiting to adopt a lab mix froze, their toddler clutching a stuffed dog. An older volunteer stacking crates in the corner paused, her hands hovering over a box. Ethan and Tara, the whispering volunteers, leaned forward, sensing drama. The air felt heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jim didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, one hand on Bravo's leash, his weathered face unreadable. "He's my dog," he said again, each word deliberate. "We've got papers to prove it." Pratt laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that made the toddler flinch. "Papers don't mean squat if you can't handle him. Look at you, half a foot in the grave, and you think you can control a dog trained for combat? That's a liability waiting to happen." The shelter manager, a stocky man in his 40s named Greg Holland, saw his chance to play the hero. He stepped out from behind a partition, his clipboard clutched like a shield. "Officer Pratt's got a point," he said loudly, addressing the growing crowd as much as Jim. "Belgian Malinois are high maintenance. They need structure, discipline, someone who can match their energy. No offense, sir, but this is about what's best for the animal." The words hit Jim like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than this. IDDs in Kandahar, nights where the only thing keeping him alive was Bravo's nose and instincts. But the casual cruelty of it, the way these strangers talked over him like he was invisible, stung in a way combat never had. Bravo, sensing the tension, shifted his weight, his eyes flicking between Pratt and Holland, assessing, waiting. Pratt took another step forward, his hand resting on his radio like he was itching to call for backup. "I'm placing this dog under evaluation," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of someone who thought he was untouchable. "You don't have the certification to own a dog with this kind of training. Hand over the leash, now." The room held its breath. The toddler's mother pulled her child closer. Ethan and Tara exchanged wide-eyed looks, their earlier smirks gone. Jim's hand tightened on the leash, his knuckles whitening, but his face remained calm, almost serene. He'd been here before, not in a shelter, but in moments where the world demanded he prove himself. Moments where the only thing that mattered was the bond he shared with the dog at his side. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried, Jim spoke a single word in German. "Schutz." The effect was immediate. Bravo snapped into action, his movements fluid and precise like a blade unsheathed. He pivoted, placing himself squarely between Jim and Pratt, his stance low and balanced, every muscle coiled with controlled power, his eyes locked onto the officer, not with aggression, but with the unyielding focus of a creature trained to protect at all costs. The lobby, already silent, seemed to freeze in time. Pratt stumbled back, his hand fumbling for his radio, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Bravo's gaze. "Call him off," Pratt's voice cracked, betraying his youth. "Call him off right now." Jim didn't move, didn't raise his voice. "He's doing his job," he said, calm as a summer morning, just like he was trained. The shelter manager, realizing he'd lost control of the situation, took a step toward his office, his clipboard forgotten. Ethan and Tara pressed themselves against the wall, their earlier judgments replaced by something closer to fear. Bravo stood firm, a living wall between his handler and the world, radiating the kind of quiet power that didn't need a growl to make its point. And then, cutting through the tension like a rifle shot, came the sound of boots on the linoleum. A new figure stepped into the lobby, her presence commanding attention without a word. Major Emily Navarro, a 38-year-old officer from the nearby Fort Campbell Military Police K-9 unit, entered with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat and come out sharper for it. Her uniform was crisp, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes swept the room with the efficiency of a predator sizing up prey. "Is there a problem with Sergeant Bravo?" she asked, her voice cold enough to make the air feel brittle. Brett blinked, his hand still hovering over his radio. You know this dog?" Navarro's smile was a blade. "Every handler in the 101st knows that dog. He dragged 2 soldiers out of a burning Humvee in Helmand Province while under fire. His handler was half dead, but Bravo didn't quit." She knelt beside the dog, her movements slow and deliberate, a sign of respect for a fellow warrior. Bravo's stance softened slightly, recognizing an ally, but he didn't break position. She stood, her gaze locking onto Pratt's. "This dog has a Bronze Star citation for valor. You want to talk about certification? You're standing in the presence of a decorated veteran. 2 of them, actually. So I suggest you rethink whatever you're about to do next." The lobby was beyond silent now. Even the kennels seemed to hold their breath. Jim Callahan, the old man they'd written off as too frail, too old, stood with the quiet dignity of someone who'd earned his scars. Bravo, the dog they'd dismissed as too much for him, was a living testament to a bond forged in blood and fire. And in that moment, the shelter wasn't just a place for paperwork. It was a battlefield where loyalty faced off against arrogance. And loyalty was winning. The Pine Creek Animal Shelter lobby felt like a pressure cooker, ready to burst. The air was thick, charged with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Jim Callahan stood like a weathered oak, his 68-year-old frame unyielding despite the storm of judgment swirling around him. Bravo, his Belgian Malinois, stood sentinel at his side, a coiled spring of loyalty and discipline. His amber eyes locked on Officer Derek Pratt. The single word Jim had spoken, "shuts," had transformed the dog into a living shield, his stance radiating a quiet, unshakable power that silenced every whisper in the room. The volunteers, Ethan and Tara, pressed against the wall, their earlier smirks replaced by wide-eyed shock. The shelter manager, Greg Holland, hovered near his office door, his clipboard forgotten, his authority crumbling under the weight of Bravo's presence. Officer Pratt, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and defiance, gripped his radio like a lifeline. "Call him off, old man," he repeated, his voice cracking like thin ice. "This is your last warning." Jim's eyes, pale blue and etched with the ghosts of battles long past, met Pratt's without flinching. "He ain't yours to take," he said, his Tennessee drawl soft but unyielding. "He's my partner. Always has been." The standoff might have spiraled into chaos if not for Major Emily Navarro, whose crisp uniform and commanding presence had already shifted the room's gravity. Her words about Bravo's Bronze Star citation hung in the air like a verdict. But Pratt wasn't ready to back down. His pride, bruised by the sudden arrival of someone who outranked him in every way that mattered, pushed him to double down. "I don't care about your war stories," he snapped, stepping closer to Jim, his boots scuffing the linoleum. "This dog's a public safety risk in your hands. You're too old, too slow. Hand over the leash or I'll have you cited for obstruction." The word "old" landed like a punch, and for the first time something flickered in Jim's expression. A shadow of pain, raw and unguarded. It wasn't the insult that hurt, it was the assumption that his years, his scars, his sacrifices could be reduced to a liability. Bravo sensed it, his ears twitching, his body tensing as if ready to absorb the blow for his handler. The crowd, families, volunteers, a janitor frozen mid-sweep watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Then Jim spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a grenade. "Platz," he said in German, the command sharp and clear. Bravo dropped instantly to the floor, his body low, eyes still fixed on Pratt, obedient yet unyielding. The act was a masterclass in control, a silent rebuke to every doubt cast on Jim's ability. The room exhaled, but the tension didn't break. It deepened. Pratt's hand hovered over his radio, his bravado faltering as he realized he was out of his depth. The dog wasn't just trained, he was an extension of Jim, a partner forged in the crucible of war, and no amount of paperwork or posturing could undo that. Major Navarro stepped forward, her boots clicking with purpose. "Officer Pratt," she said, her voice low and lethal. You're about to make a mistake that'll cost you more than your badge. She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the volunteers, the manager, the onlookers. This dog, Sergeant Bravo, isn't just a pet. He's a veteran of the 101st Airborne. In 2019, he pulled 2 soldiers from a burning Humvee in Helmand Province while taking shrapnel to his flank. His handler, Mr. Callahan, was pinned under debris, bleeding out, and Bravo didn't hesitate. He dragged Jim to safety, then went back for the others, under fire, with no one giving him orders. Her words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping away the casual cruelty of the room's earlier judgments. A woman in the crowd clutching her toddler wiped at her eyes. Ethan, the volunteer who'd called Jim half-dead, stared at the floor, his face pale. Tara's pink hair seemed to wilt as she shrank against the wall. Greg Holland, the manager, opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his clipboard now a useless prop. Devereaux knelt beside Bravo, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, a gesture of respect that spoke of her own time with canine units. This dog has a Bronze Star for valor, she continued, her voice steady but thick with emotion. He's got more courage in one paw than most people muster in a lifetime. And you, she stood, her eyes boring into Pratt, you think you can just take him? You think you can break a bond forged in blood because you've got a badge and a rule book? Pratt's face twisted, caught between defiance and shame. I'm just doing my job, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Your job? Navarro's laugh was sharp, cutting. Your job is to protect, not to tear apart what's already been through hell. Federal law protects military working dogs and their handlers. You try to separate Bravo from Mr. Callahan, and you're not just breaking policy. You're obstructing military operations. You want to explain that to a JAG officer? The mention of federal law hit like a thunderclap. Pratt's hand dropped from his radio, his shoulders slumping. The crowd murmured, a low hum of shock and realization. A teenage girl in the corner, who'd been filming the whole thing on her phone, gasped softly, her thumb still hovering over the record button. Jim, silent through it all, reached down and scratched behind Bravo's ears, the gesture so tender it seemed to belong to another world, a world where trust was absolute, where loyalty didn't need to be proven. Navarro turned to Jim, her demeanor softening. Mr. Callahan, sir, she said, her voice carrying the respect of one soldier to another. The 101st has been trying to track down Bravo's final service records. His medical retirement left gaps in our unit history. If you're willing, we'd like your help to complete his file. That dog's a legend at Fort Campbell. Jim's eyes, misty now, stayed on Bravo. He came home, he said simply, his voice breaking just enough to crack the hearts of everyone listening. That's all that ever mattered to us. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years, years of midnight patrols, of dust and blood, of moments when Bravo's nose had been the only thing standing between Jim and a flag-draped coffin. The toddler's mother was openly crying now, her hand over her mouth. The janitor set his broom against the wall, his eyes glistening. Even Pratt, for all his bluster, looked away, unable to meet Jim's gaze. Bravo, sensing the shift, rose to his feet, his movements fluid and deliberate. He pressed his flank against Jim's leg, a quiet reassurance that said, I'm here. I've always been here. The room, once a stage for judgment, became something else, a sanctuary for a bond that no one could break. The teenage girl's phone was still recording, capturing every second of a moment that would soon ripple far beyond the walls of Pine Creek. The Pine Creek Animal Shelter, once a quiet outpost on a Tennessee back road, was now a lightning rod for a story that refused to stay contained. By nightfall, the teenage girl's video, 6 minutes of raw, unfiltered truth capturing Jim Callahan's stand against Officer Derek Pratt and the shelter's dismissive staff, had exploded across the internet. Uploaded to TikTok with the simple caption, they tried to take his hero dog. One word changed everything. It racked up 1 million views before the moon rose over the Smoky Mountains. By dawn, it was trending on every platform, X, Instagram, YouTube, shared by veterans, dog lovers, and everyday Americans who saw in Jim and Bravo a defiance that resonated deep in their bones. The footage of Bravo's flawless Schutz command, Major Emily Navarro's razor-sharp intervention, and Jim's quiet, heart-wrenching words, "He came home," became a rallying cry for those who'd ever felt judged, dismissed, or forgotten. In the video, Jim's weathered face and Bravo's unyielding stance told a story louder than words. Comments poured in like a digital flood. "This is what loyalty looks like. That dog would die for him and they tried to take him away. Shame on that shelter." Veterans from across the country shared their own stories in the threads. Memories of canine partners who'd saved their lives in Iraq, Afghanistan, or forgotten corners of the world. A retired Marine wrote, "I served with a Malinois like Bravo. Those dogs don't just follow orders. They carry your soul." The video wasn't just viral, it was a movement, a mirror held up to a nation that too often overlooked its quiet heroes. The fallout at Pine Creek was swift and merciless. By noon the next day, the shelter's phone lines were jammed with calls, angry veterans, local reporters, even a congressman's aide demanding answers. The hashtag Justice for Jim and Bravo trended nationwide, and a Change.org petition calling for policy reform at the shelter hit 50,000 signatures in 48 hours. Greg Holland, the manager who'd lectured Jim about what's best for the animal, was gone by Monday, his resignation announced in a curt press release that did little to quell the public's outrage. Ethan, the volunteer who'd mocked Jim's age, quietly transferred to a shelter 2 counties over, his bravado replaced by a newfound silence. Tara, the pink-headed volunteer, posted a tearful apology video, promising to volunteer at a veterans therapy dog program to make things right, but the damage was done. Pine Creek's reputation was in tatters, and the shelter's board scrambled to respond. Within a week, new policies were in place. A memo circulated to every animal shelter in Tennessee declared that retired military working dogs could not be separated from their handlers without written approval from military command. Staff were mandated to undergo training on veteran affairs and service animal recognition, a program spearheaded by Major Emily Navarro herself, who'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel for her handling of the incident. The shelter's website now featured a prominent section on military K9S, with Bravo's photo, a stoic silhouette against the shelter's linoleum floor, as its centerpiece. But the changes went beyond Pine Creek. The video sparked a national conversation, and by month's end, Tennessee lawmakers introduced the Bravo Protection Act, a bill to safeguard the rights of military dog handlers and ensure retired K9S were treated with the respect they'd earned. It was a legacy Jim and Bravo hadn't asked for, but one they'd ignited with a single word. Jim, now 68, but carrying the weight of a younger man's fire, didn't watch the video. He didn't have a smartphone, didn't care for the internet's noise. But he felt its ripple every time he walked into Pine Creek, where he'd begun volunteering twice a week. The shelter, once a place of judgment, became a classroom where Jim taught new dog owners the patience and trust he'd learned with Bravo. Families adopting their first pets watched in awe as Bravo demonstrated commands with the precision of a drill sergeant, his calm demeanor easing the fears of nervous kids. Jim's workshops were simple but profound, always starting with the same truth. A dog don't care about your age or your bank account. He cares if you show up every day, no excuses. Bravo at 7 was a living lesson in loyalty, his presence a reminder that some bonds are stronger than steel. The shelter's toughest cases, dogs surrendered for biting, fear, or distrust, became Jim's mission. Where trainers with degrees and clipboards failed, Jim and Bravo succeeded, their quiet partnership coaxing broken animals back to trust. One afternoon, a scarred pit mix named Rusty, who'd been slated for euthanasia after snapping at staff, lay calmly at Bravo's side as Jim spoke softly to him. "You ain't broke," Jim told the dog, his voice. "You just need someone who understands." The room, filled with wide-eyed adopters, was silent, save for the soft click of Bravo's paws as he shifted to nudge Rusty's flank, a gesture of solidarity that brought tears to a volunteer's eyes. But the story wasn't over. 3 years after the video changed everything, a Tuesday morning in March brought a quiet that felt wrong. Jim woke to find Bravo still in his favorite bed in the corner of their farmhouse living room, the morning sun spilling across his black and tan fur. But Bravo didn't stir. At 10 years old, he'd slipped away in his sleep, his heart finally resting after a life of service. Jim sat beside him for hours, one hand on Bravo's flank, the silence louder than any battlefield. No media, no fanfare. Just a man and his dog, saying goodbye to a piece of his soul. The funeral was small, held in the veterans section of Pine Creek Cemetery, where Bravo's headstone read, Sergeant Bravo, K-9 hero, he answered every call. 6 soldiers from the 101st Airborne, men and women who'd known Bravo in Afghanistan, stood in silent salute. 2 retired K-9s, gray-muzzled and slow, attended with their handlers, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding. Jim hung Bravo's leather leash on a hook in the shelter's lobby, where it became a quiet monument, a brass plaque beneath it reading, "One command, one bond, one life shared in full." Jim, now 71, still volunteered at Pine Creek, his steps slower, but his purpose unchanged. He worked alone now, yet sometimes paused as if hearing Bravo's pause on the concrete. New handlers sought him out, young soldiers with fresh canine partners, their eyes wide with questions only Jim could answer. "Love 'em while you got 'em," he'd say, his voice thick with memory. "Train 'em like lives depend on it, 'cause they do." But whispers were stirring in Pine Creek. The Bravo Protection Act, though passed, faced challenges. Bureaucrats in Nashville questioning its cost, local shelters pushing back on oversight, and then there was the letter delivered to Jim's farmhouse just days ago, unsigned but official-looking, hinting at a review of Bravo's military records, questioning whether Jim's adoption had been properly authorized. Someone, somewhere, wasn't done testing the bond they'd fought so hard to protect. As Jim stood in the shelter teaching a young couple how to earn a rescue dog's trust, his eyes drifted to Bravo's leash on the wall. A storm was coming, and Jim Callahan, the man who'd faced fire with a dog by his side, wasn't about to back down.